Hi, everybody. Happy Friday. This is December 15th. Today's discussion will really go over the questions that were given yesterday in the blue graphical, not the graphical, but the guided reading review worksheet. There's 4 questions at the top of 15.2. The first question deals with the Hoovervilles. Second question deals with the Dust Bowl. Third one deals with the struggles and pressures men and women faced during the Depression. And then the fourth question deals with the discrimination that takes place or that increases greatly as a result of this depression. So first, the only question here for today actually answers number 2. In our area, so we look at number 2, some of the conditions that would lead to a Dust Bowl. Obviously, we'll get to some of those conditions here today, but we'll look at some of these areas. But the one thing I want you to pay attention to in this picture is some of the dust storms that had accrued or had picked up in the Great Depression here. A lot of these dust storms were very, very occurrent a lot in the 1930s. Specifically in 1935, Black Sunday is what they called it. A dust storm picks up in Boise City, Oklahoma, and it pretty much travels across the country to where the next few days, many ships out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean report seeing like brown dust on the hulls of their ships because the dust had traveled that far out. The jet stream, the air currents, they pushed everything out to sea, essentially to many ships that were out there. So, these dust storms are massive in terms of their size. But, the conditions that led to it, we'll get to some of them here moving forward. But let's, before I get into some of the stuff here, I have the sheet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to type up some of these answers here in italicized font so you can see what they are. If I get past this, make sure you pause it. That way you get these answers written down in the sheet. That way you can come back to class, on Monday and Tuesday next week to really get this, part here with 15.3 so you can really catch up. You don't have to do a whole lot of copying down, all right? So the first question looking at, and I'm going to go back and forth to the PowerPoint versus this because I really want to show you some pictures and kind of do like how I did in class today because I feel like I owe it to you to see how it's like in class. So obviously, who lived in the Hoovervilles? It's going to be those who kicked out of their houses. All right, industrial workers, all these people that really lost everything in the stock market or as a result of the stock market crash and eventually the depression, they were really the ones that had to take these individuals and really build these Hoovervilles. They were built because they obviously could not afford All right, so it's about they couldn't afford to live in a rental property, anything that required a monthly payment, like a mortgage, anything else like that. But many people they were really left out because of this. Now I have some pictures here I want to show you of this. Some of these Hoovervilles. Obviously these are called Hoover hotels. Herbert Hoover his name was used as a punching bag quite often. One of these shacks that these people built are called Hoover hotels. A collection of these shacks are called Hoovervilles. If you had a Hoover blanket, you had pretty much it was just a whole bunch of newspapers tied together to form a blanket, so you could either sleep on or have it covered over top of you. Again, they used his name as a punching bag. They had Hoover flags, which people, when they pulled their pockets inside out, signified that they had no money. That was a new fashion style at this point. Yes, I'm not lying to you. That was a fashion style at this time period. People wanted to really hound on President Hoover for his inability to make things better for the people who had suffered a lot during this depression early on. So, that Americans living in these shacks. Here's another example. You can see the kid here in this one. Collection of these shacks here put together. Some of them had doors, some of them just have doorways. But we have a lot of this stuff here. Another example of these people building these houses on their own. There's no organization to it. Any empty plot of land that was open and available, people built homes in. They dug out, maybe they dug underneath the ground to build their homes. You can see that maybe something right through here. Definitely, life was not always the same when we look at these issues and how cities were really turned into these shack homes. They took you can kind of see a sign here, some tin they put on the side of the walls. But yeah, it's just not the best of conditions at this time. All right, but these are the Hoovervilles, and these are the people. These are what people lived in, especially those who could not afford to live at a community. Now, the question I got a lot in some of the classes was: were people very were they respectful of the privacy and also of the hard work people put forward in building these homes? I mean, people didn't steal these from somebody else after they were built, specifically if you were desperate. Obviously there was a lot of jockeying for position as to who got what plot or who used what resources. But at the same time, if you built a house like this on your own, very rarely did you get anybody coming in trying to take that from you. All right, people weren't really that greedy. They didn't really take a lot of opportunity to show their greed too much, because everybody was in the same boat. And I think if everybody worked together, more and more people were benefited by that. So we didn't see a lot of that. So that's what we have there. For this second question, I'll actually put it in this section right here. What reasons did farmers give for the dust storms that led to the Dust Bowl in the North Central Plains? Obviously, the first one is drought, which equals no rain. All right. Poor farming practices. High temperatures and high winds. And finally, the last one was the upheaval. Native grasses. Obviously, the grass is planted a lot in our society today to keep the soil in the ground. Yes, it looks nice when it's cut and mowed, but there's a real aesthetic reason behind it. It's not because it looks nice and it's really but there's a literal reason as to why people use grass as something to plant in the ground. It's mostly because that some of these grasses help keep the soil together. So when you have no rain, you have poor farming practices, high temperatures and high winds, and then upheaval of these grasses, you lead to a lot of conditions of what you would normally see in these dust storms, what I started showing in the first one. Now, obviously drought, rainfall halted through the 1930s. At this point, you can see the temperatures. Again, this is 1936, the years we're talking about, compared to the 30 years of 71 to 2000. Look how much hotter temperatures were in 1936 compared to these other years. So obviously, this is where we see the Dust Bowl take place. In the middle central part of this country. All right. Obviously, over-farming had a big role to play. Many Americans took the grasses out of the ground to plant their own crops. And the reason why that's a problem is sometimes in these areas, the winds blow 50% of the year for about 60 to 70 miles an hour consistently. There's nothing stopping these winds from getting the massive speeds that they have. So there's nothing blocking these winds. 50 to 60 miles an hour or up to 70 miles an hour for 50% of the year, there's only reason grass grows there is because grass can survive those high winds. They're not going to be removed. They're not going to fall over. It's not going to be uprooted. So when you have that, it's a reason why key to the survival of farms. Hold the topsoil together, whether it's in dry conditions or wet conditions as well. Grass is meant to hold everything together. Also, trees are planted as well on this edge of farms, which we didn't see a whole lot of during the Dust Bowl at this time period. No trees existed in these areas, but as we continue to see farms kind of prop up after the Dust Bowl, more and more conservation practices are put forward. That's what we talk about of some of these tactics. Now, what really destroys the farmers is pretty much the same reason why businesses and also people's savings are wiped out. It's mostly because of banks. Now, it's not banks' fault because of this. It's mostly because farmers were put in a pretty bad spot after World War I. Now, during World War I, the production required farmers to borrow money. You don't have to write any of this down. This is just a kind of a step-by-step process I'm using here to help show you how people lost everything. But World War I production required many farmers to borrow money to acquire the latest technology. They bought a lot of tractors, a lot of equipment that cost a lot of money. They borrowed that money to buy that stuff, which again, we know with borrowing money, it can get risky. Now, as the Depression gripped the country, people didn't need to buy as many goods, or at least they couldn't afford to buy crops that were harvested. So with a surplus of crops and a shrinking money supply, farmers only have one thing to do with their prices, and that's to lower them. It's just like when anybody has a liquidation sale, you're just trying to get rid of stuff. You're going to lower those prices, and you're going to take the hit on some of these profits that you're expecting to make, which obviously went away. Because these farmers, not even could they make a profit, but they barely had a tough time breaking even. Paying for this farm equipment, paying for the resources needed to plant the crops, but then also trying to harvest them and then selling them. The profits just weren't there, and sometimes they had a tough time breaking even. As a result, farmers could no longer pay back the loans they had taken out for farming, for the farming equipment that they made. And then last but not least, many farmers as a collateral had to sell their farms to pay off the banks, although banks took these farmlands and pretty much didn't do anything with them. All right? If you're a banker, you don't know how to farm. So when you take the land from the farmer, you're going to keep it barren and dry, which means there are no grasses or anything planted to keep the soil together. So when that happens, many of this topsoil is left free to roam around. You think you're talking about 10 feet worth of topsoil. You think that number? You're talking about from, if you're standing right underneath the basketball hoop, from where your feet are to where the basketball hoop is, where the ball needs to go in. That's how much topsoil have been removed. 10 feet. It's a lot of topsoil that's removed at this point. So something to think about when moving forward. That there is a major, a major upheaval here of topsoil and why these dust storms really do occur. All right. So that's some of the conditions we talked about before as to why this dust storms in the north central plains and the reasons that farmers give. So there's no drought. Obviously, a lot of natural reasons: the winds, high temperatures. But when farmers don't, keep the stalks of corn or they don't keep roots into the ground when they harvest the plant or whatever they've planted, that hurts. But also with upheaval of native grasses, when farmers actually try to farm this land, they try to take those natural grasses out and they try to plant something that really shouldn't go there with the high winds and that really would negatively impact these crops. All right. Moving on with number 3. What are some of the pressures of men during the Great Depression? Obviously, many men during the 20s, they had the sole responsibility to provide for their family. Which became much more difficult. So as they look for work in every quarter of the country, men had a lot of pressure because they're the breadwinners, they're the ones who are supposed to provide for their families. And not many people receive pressure from outside influences, but many husbands and men put pressure on themselves because, they were told for the longest time, you go work, you make money, you provide for your family. If you can do that, you're going to be, a good husband, a good man. You're going to be someone that can be supported and relied upon. During this depression, many men saw themselves as not being relied upon. They're not reliable sources of income. They're not doing their jobs as men and husbands. So we really see some major problems here. But many women face some issues as well. With women, all right. So not only did men have to go leave and find work at every corner of the country, but when they left their families alone with the moms essentially to not only raise the family but also feed the children with whatever they could do as well. So it doesn't help the family at all when you kind of take the men out of the picture to have them go look for money. So women really do have to do a brunt of the work to not only keep the children alive and fed, but also to make sure that that they make money for the kids. So it's definitely a difficult job. Plus, many women were expected to give up their low-paying jobs, which they were relegated to in the 20s. Now, this is ironic. The women were given these low-paying jobs in the 20s, but as the 1930s and the Depression grips, it really is a major issue for a lot of people as well. All right, so women have to give up their jobs for these men. Then finally, discrimination grows because competition for jobs makes all right. So obviously the competition for jobs here makes everything really weary. Throughout this video, if you want to pause it right now, you can get these answers and make them up. But this is pretty much what we did. We just reviewed this worksheet, went through some of these issues. I have a video on my Canvas page you can take a look at as well. I also have a little article about the Dust Bowl that we didn't get to in class, but if you want to kind of hit the Dust Bowl on your own, you may do that. All right, so that's all we have for today. And next week we'll look at 15.3. Have a great weekend.